Welcome to Module 1, Understanding Learning Disabilities and Characteristics of Learning Disabilities. The required readings for this week were an article about characteristics of children with learning disabilities, an article titled Understanding, Educating, and Supporting Children with Specific Learning Disabilities, an article about Introduction to Learning Disabilities, as well as Chapter 1 of our textbook. We're going to start by defining learning disabilities. A learning disability can be defined as a neurological disorder that affects the brain's ability to receive, process, store, and respond to information. The term learning disability is used to describe a seemingly unexplained difficulty that a person has of acquiring basic skills and information when they're at least at average intelligence or near average or above average intelligence. These skills are things that are essential for success in school and work and just coping with life in general. So children with learning disabilities are a very heterogeneous group. So it's not the same among all students with learning disabilities. You'd meet one student who has a learning disability and another, and they are very, very different people, even if they have a learning disability in the same area. There are 3 areas that are described: mild, moderate, and severe. And also students differ in their way of coping with these learning disabilities, whether not all students require special education services or only some do. One thing about learning disabilities is that problems persist from primary grades through the end of their formal schooling. So it's not something that usually stops in the middle of a school experience. It's usually something that lingers and causes lifelong problems. Students with learning disabilities will have a discrepancy between their ability and their achievement. A lot of times they'll have strengths similar to their peers in a lot of areas, but their rate of learning is just unexpectedly slower. Specific learning disabilities can be broken down into 4 major categories: reading, writing, math, and language. So in reading, there's basic reading skills, reading fluency, and reading comprehension. Reading is the most prevalent area of learning disabilities. 90% of students who are diagnosed with a learning disability have some sort of reading difficulty, which does not necessarily mean they have a reading disability, but they have difficulty in the area of reading. Basic reading skills includes phonological awareness and phonics. Fluency is about the oral process of reading fluency. And comprehension includes comprehension and vocabulary skills. In the area of writing, we have written expression. In the area of math, there's math calculations as well as math reasoning. And in the area of language, there are oral expression and listening comprehension. So these areas mean that the child does not meet the state-approved age or grade level standards in one or more of the following areas. So a student can be eligible under multiple areas or one single area of a specific learning disability. And we're going to go into those more specifically now. So the first area we'll talk about is reading fluency. Reading fluency is the rate of accurate reading, so it's the correct words that a child may read per minute. Reading fluency is a very important indicator of reading ability. Becoming a skilled reader is extremely important in our society, so trouble with reading is a huge indicator of problems and puts individuals with this disability at a very large disadvantage in school and in the workplace. Some common oral reading problems are omissions, which means that the student skips individual words or a group of words. Substitutions, so a student replaces one or more words in the passage by one or more meaningful words. A gross mispronunciation of words, which means that a student pronounces a word and it bears little resemblance to the proper pronunciation. Hesitation, which means the student hesitates for 2 or more seconds before pronouncing a word, as well as inversion, which changes the order of words appearing in the sentence. This visual shows a way of calculating and describing reading fluency, and also talks about the levels of independent instructional and frustration, which you might see on things like running records or different assessments that might test reading fluency. The next area is reading comprehension, which is the ability to understand what the student is reading. So often students may be able to read so fluently that you'd assume they're highly proficient readers, but they might have little or no understanding of what the words actually mean. This could be called being a word caller. So sometimes this is a lot harder to identify in students, but they might just have problems after reading with analyzing what it means. There are 6 types of reading comprehension skills. The first is literal comprehension, so a student reads and then answers questions directly about the text. Inferential comprehension, so a student reads and then interprets what's being read. Listening comprehension, where an examiner will read and the students ask questions about what the examiner read. Critical comprehension, where a student reads and then analyzes, evaluates, or makes judgments about what they read. Affective comprehension, where the student reads and the examiner evaluates the emotional response to the text. And lexical comprehension, which a student reads, the examiner assesses the knowledge of vocabulary words. So some common comprehension problems that students with this disability may have are difficulty recalling basic facts, difficulty with sequence of the story or text, and then also difficulty differentiating the main theme or main idea of a text. Some major indicators of reading comprehension problems are that students may guess at an answer, they may show an unwillingness to read overall, skip unknown words altogether instead of trying, etc. The next area is basic reading skills. So basic reading skills talks about word recognition, skills of phonics, sight word reading, as well as using context. These rely heavily on cognitive skills such as perception, selective attention, memory, and metacognitive skills. So common word recognition errors are similar to the reading fluency errors, where we have omissions, insertions, substitutions, mispronunciations, as well as transpositions, unknown words, or slow, choppy reading. Reading habits to be aware of and things to kind of look for are tension movements, insecurity, a student losing its place in reading a lot, lateral head movements, and then also if students hold their materials very close to them. These are important things to look for in students and may indicate that there's a larger problem. The next area of specific learning disabilities is written expression. So written expression is a highly complex method of expression involving integration of eye-hand linguistic and conceptual abilities. It's really that ability to write both composition, spelling, as well, and handwriting. So for composition, it's the ability to generate ideas and express them in acceptable grammar while adhering to stylistic conventions. It's the ability to sit down and actually compose or write something that you are being asked to write. Spelling is the ability to use letters to construct words in accordance with acceptable usage. So really using what you know about letters and sounds to construct words that are appropriate and sound correct. Poor spelling occurs with poor reading and or arithmetic as well. So there a lot of times that poor spelling is connected to different reading disabilities as well as math disabilities. Many learned skills required for good spellers are the same ones that enable students to become good readers. So again, there's a big connection between those areas. Also handwriting, so the ability to actually execute physically and make marks on the paper. And some characteristics to look for in students that may struggle with writing and may have a written expression disability are students may get overwhelmed with the idea of getting started with their writing. They may struggle to organize and use mechanics of writing, struggle to develop fluency in writing. They may have difficulty spelling and constructing written products in a legible fashion. They may submit assignments that are extremely short, and other things like that. Students with writing difficulties seldom use self-regulation and self-assessment strategies that competent writers do. So they struggle to set a goal, plan and guide their writing, organize their ideas, draft, self-assess, rewrite, that whole writing process. Written expression is also the last academic skill that children master, so it's often something that is identified later. Next is math calculations. So math calculations really deals with the actual idea of computation problems, arithmetic skills only. So addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, not thinking about those higher level thinking skills required with math, but more of the actual calculation itself. Math calculations is linked to attention as well as phonological processing. So again, this isn't just about math. It really is linked to other areas that students may struggle with, especially if they have a specific learning disability. Computational analysis. So some things that they may struggle with are having incorrect operations. So if it's asking you to add, they may subtract, incorrect number facts, incorrect algorithms, or random errors, also called slips. So even before formal education begins, children are exposed to various situations that involve the application of mathematical concepts, things like estimating, doing computational skills, solving problems, understanding measurement, using math to predict, creating reading graphs, charts. So some math difficulties may be due to either deficits in phonological processing of the features of spoken numbers or failure to grasp those meaningful concepts. And it can start with a lack of a foundation of it at a young age. About 25% of individuals with learning disabilities receive assistance because of difficulties with math, and 43% of students with a math disability also have reading problems. Computation differentiates between the systematic computation errors and errors that are just careless mistakes. So there is a difference that needs to be noted here, that it's not just simple random careless mistakes in this area. It's not always that random error or slip. Usually there is something larger behind it. The next area is math reasoning. So this often appears later in their schooling process. Students may be unable to sort critical extraneous information. They struggle to recognize correct computational procedure or determine whether or not an answer that they obtain is reasonable. They have difficulty using math concepts, rules, and formulas, and this disability is linked to language comprehension as well as reasoning. 50% of students with learning disabilities have IEP goals in math. Math reasoning disabilities appear in later grades, like I said, or at least more evident in later grades because of the processes that they ask students to do. Oftentimes, they are not things that we are asking primary younger grades to do. The last area of specific learning disabilities is language. So this includes both the oral expression and listening comprehension area of a specific learning disability. So these things include things like syntax, which are rule systems that determine how words are organized into sentences, semantics, which talks about the actual word meanings, and then phonology, which is the study of how individual sounds make up words. So when students have oral language problems, it often affects academic as well as social interactions. So these things could be like problems choosing the appropriate words in situations, problems understanding complex sentence structures, problems responding to questions, and difficulty retrieving words. Now, all of these can be things that happen in an academic setting, but they also are things that happen in social settings. Participating in conversations can be especially troublesome for students with learning disabilities in these areas. Nonverbal language clues may also be overlooked in these areas. Some common attributes and characteristics across the board within the area of learning disabilities, problems with attention. So if they can't sustain attention for more than a short period of time, they have excessive daydreaming, they're highly distractible, things like that. It is important to note that ADHD and learning disabilities are not the same, but there's a notable overlap. So students with learning disabilities have attention problems range from about 41% to 80%. And then there's also an overlap of 10 to 25% between ADHD and learning disabilities being within the diagnosis. Difficulties with attention make learning extremely difficult. So in order to be an effective learner, children must be able to initiate attention, direct attention appropriately, sustain attention according to task demands, and shift attention when appropriate. So that is the disorders of attention. Next would be reading difficulties, poor motor abilities they may have, written language difficulties, oral language difficulties, social skill deficits, phonological processing problems, quantitative disorders, as well as problems processing information. Now, this is to be said that not all students with disabilities exhibit any or all of these characteristics, and many who demonstrate these behaviors can be quite successful in the classroom, but these are just a list of common attributes within the area of learning disabilities. It's also essential as a future educator in developing pre-referral interventions, making appropriate referrals, identifying effective adaptations and intervention strategies. So it's another reason we want to look at these characteristics, is so that we can be thinking in the eyes of an educator when thinking about maybe having to refer students. In addition to that list of characteristics, we also have some other common themes. So the first is memory deficits, which I think are really important to think about. So memory deficits means that they may have skills that are inconsistent. Students might have significant difficulties remembering academic and non-academic information. They may have trouble remembering when they have a doctor's appointment, when they have a homework assignment, multiplication facts, directions, phone numbers, etc., things like that that are both academic and non-academic. They can be very inconsistent. So maybe one day a student will have their multiplication facts memorized, the next day they can't remember 1 times 1. Students with learning disabilities also, they'll have deficits in short-term memory as well as working memory, but they do not usually show problems with long-term memory. So the next slides, they are a few visuals of the memory processes, but short-term memory is the ability to recall information after short periods of time. Working memory is when the individual is able to retain information while engaging in another activity. So holding a small amount of information in your mind while you're also focusing on a task. And then long-term memory is your brain system for storing information over extended periods of times, allowing individuals to recall past experiences, knowledge, and events that can last for years. So essentially acts as the permanent storage space for memories and things that are transferred from short-term memory. And there's a seemingly unlimited capacity to hold information in that long-term memory. Students with disabilities have problems with the following: retaining learned information, repeating information that they read or heard, following multiple directions or multi-step directions, and performing tasks in the correct sequence. It also appears often that they don't use strategies for remembering the way that their non-disabled peers may. So they don't have those strategies for remembering and coming up with ways to remember. And they have an inability to code new information for memory storage and a decreased motivation for difficult mental effort. However, when students are taught a memory strategy, they perform memory tasks as well as their non-disabled peers. So that's important to remember as well. Excuse me. The next area is cognitive deficits, which are about thinking and problem solving. So students often exhibit disorganized thinking that results in problems with planning and organizing their lives at home. So characteristics of this may be students making poor decisions, trouble adjusting to change, making frequent errors, requiring concrete demonstrations, delayed verbal response, difficulty understanding social expectations, requiring more direct supervision, trouble getting started and initiating tasks, and trouble using those previously learned information in new situations. The next area is metacognition deficits. So this is one's understanding of strategies available for learning a task and regulatory mechanisms needed to complete the task. So 3 components of this area are recognizing task requirements, selecting and implementing appropriate strategies, and then monitoring and adjusting performance. So students with learning disabilities often have problems with all 3 of those components, figuring out what they're being asked to do, finding a strategy to do it, and then monitoring and adjusting based on how things are going within that strategy. The next area is social emotional problems. Students with learning disabilities often have strengths in the area, or sometimes have strengths in the area of social skills, but several characteristics of learning disabilities note that they have concerns with the difficulties in social and emotional aspects of life, especially those who have problems with language abilities, which are those oral expression and listening comprehension areas. Students with learning disabilities have higher than normal rates of behavior problems in the classroom among students in their general education classrooms. They also could have deficits in social cognition. So some major characteristics in this area are misreading social cues, misinterpreting someone else's feelings, not knowing when they're bothering other people, being unaware of the effect of their behavior on someone else, being unable to take the perspective or put themselves in someone else's shoes. In addition, years of failure can really create concerns. So, in a study from 1992, it said that 36% of the sample of students with learning disabilities indicated problems with depression, which leads to our next area, motivational and attribution problems. So, students may lose their motivation to succeed in school and take on an external locus of control, which is the belief that a person's behavior is guided by external factors like luck or fate rather than their own actions and decisions. So, students with learning disabilities may begin to anticipate failure. They may begin to have learned helplessness, which is a condition in which a person has the sense of powerlessness arising from persistent failure to succeed. So an example of this would be a student who has consistently not done well on exams may begin to just stop studying and preparing for the test altogether because they already, quote unquote, know they won't do well. And then students also may become a passive or inactive learner. These next slides, like I mentioned before, are some visuals to talk about working memory as well as short-term and long-term memory. Short-term and long-term memory here. Next, we're going to talk about the history of identification of learning disabilities. So we're going to go into this just a little bit today. The first identification of learning disabilities was with a medical strand. So there was a stroke patient in 1676, so long ago. Johannes Schmidt described an adult who lost his ability to read but kept his ability to spell and write from a stroke. So they started studying things from this person. And then as well as someone who had quote unquote word blindness in 1896. So more cases about students who are unable to learn to read despite success in math and no evidence of things like brain injuries became coined as word blindness. This medical strand laid the foundation for targeted investigations and presentation of specific, unexpected difficulty related to reading printed words despite typical intelligence, motivation, and opportunities for learning. The next started with that development of the DSM-5, so it was directly related to the development of the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which talked about the achievement discrepancy. So again, that means the discrepancy between someone who has normal intelligence levels but are struggling in school. So the DSM-1 in 1952 talked about chronic brain syndromes and focused largely on behavioral presentations that we now recognize as ADHD. DSM-2 in 1968 talked about things like mild brain damage or minimal brain dysfunction as children with chronic brain syndromes manifested by hyperactive and impulsive behavior, along with a new category of hyperkinetic reaction of childhood. So again, early on, a lot of these were related to attention problems as well as things that we now would refer to as ADHD. Then DSM-3 was developed in 1980, DSM-4 in 1994. So in DSM-3, that formally separated ADHD and then academic skill disorders. DSM-4 differentiated reading, math, and written expression learning disabilities. And then lastly, in DSM-5, it stated that SLD can manifest in 3 major academic domains of reading, math, and writing. There will be more in this and other modules. But overall, this area talked about that minimal brain dysfunction representing as children near average or above average general intelligence with learning or behavioral disabilities associated with deviations of functions of the central nervous system. And also these students failed with the general one-size-fits-all interventions, which leads us to our next area of identification of learning disabilities, which is the newest method originated from the development of effective interventions based on models observed with academical difficulties. And it's also based on the identification of lack of progress with Tier 2 and 3 instruction via things like RTI and MTSS methods. This also gave exclusionary factors or criteria, which states that students diagnosed with learning disabilities cannot be primarily due to other disabilities like intellectual disabilities or a cognitive impairment, a sensory disorder, emotional disturbances or emotional impairments, or economic and cultural factors or problems. So this area showed like RTI with an inadequate progress in response to adequate classroom instruction at Tier 1, and then supplemental intervention in small groups at Tier 2, as well as more intensive individualized interventions on Tier 3 if students failed in all of those areas or failed to make significant progress in those areas. They were often referred to for special education services in the area of learning disabilities. An advantage of this method is that intervention is provided prior to determining eligibility for special education. It's not just stating that, oh, the student's having a hard time learning in school, they need to be in special ed. Some disadvantages are that RTI approaches may not identify high potential children who struggle to develop appropriate academic skills. There's also a low agreement across the board for different methods for defining RTI. And then there's also challenges with schools adequately implementing the RTI framework. This next visual is from our textbook. It shows a timeline of those 3 strands of science and practice in the field of SLD that we just discussed on the last slide. Continuing with that exclusionary factors area, we're not going to use this word here, but this means that the disability is not attributable due to another disability, sensory disorders, emotional disturbances, or economic and cultural factors. So, for example, if there is evidence of a lack of instruction in reading and math, so if a student has not been giving effective instruction and interventions in those areas, we cannot identify them as being a student with learning disabilities. Again, also with something like a visual, hearing, or motor impairment, if a big problem is that they had a visual impairment that was unidentified for a long time, they may have missed a lot of instruction, so we cannot identify them as a student with learning disabilities. Also with an emotional disturbance or an emotional impairment, environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantages with situational trauma, and limited English proficiency. So this is another big prevalent one that we see in schools often now, where students are not having English as their first language, and they're being referred to for special education services because they're struggling in school. Well, are they struggling in school because they have a learning disability, or is it because they have limited English proficiency, and that's what we need to target for intervention? So this is an example of an SLD MET document in my district. So when you are trying to say that someone is eligible for special education under the specific learning disability, they have to check yes to all of these boxes. So it says the inadequate achievement is not primarily the result of these things. So that's the presence of visual, hearing, or motor disabilities, cognitive impairments, emotional impairments, or autism. It's also not primarily the result of cultural factors, environmental or economic disadvantages, and limited English proficiency. So similar to what we had just said, but this is the actual documentation. So in order to say that you have a learning disability and you're eligible under that area, you must be able to check yes to all of these. In addition to that, you also have to be able to check yes to this next box, that there's an adverse educational impact. So that the suspected disability interferes with the access to and progress in the general education curriculum, and that the student requires special education programs and services in order to be successful. We're also going to talk about this idea of co-occurrence and comorbidity. So one reason SLD can be very difficult to define and identify is because of these overlaps. So this visual shows that someone who could have disorder A as well as disorder B. So they might have a learning disability. They might also have ADHD. So they are hard to identify and define because of that overlap. So some common co-occurrences are anxiety disorders, behavioral disorders, depressive disorders, motor delays, neurodevelopmental disabilities like ADHD, a second learning disability. So they may have a learning disability in reading and in the area of math. Social emotional problems like social deficits, speech and language delays or a speech and language impairment, etc. So getting into chapter 1 of our text, Special education was established to ensure that students with disabilities were provided opportunities to reach their learning and post school potential. So, that was a quote from the text that I enjoyed to talk about really this introduction to teaching students with special needs. Special education has changed a lot since then, and so has the role of a special education professional. The majority of students with disabilities now receive most or all of their education in a general education classroom and have access to the general education curriculum, where at the start of special education, they did not have that. So we've come a long way, and there's still a long way to go. We'll quickly talk about the populations of students with disabilities. So, prevalence data also can be very varied based on states. So, there are some ideas that there's 6% in this state, 12 in this state. For this example down here of there was 6.4% in Hawaii, 12.2 in New Jersey. So, taking all of these statistics with a grain of salt, but this is prevalence data presented in reference to students with specific learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, emotional disturbances, as well as other health impairments. Students with learning disabilities make up 66.3% of individuals served under IDEA, and nationwide, 6.1% of the school population has learning disabilities. This was a nice figure, again, from our textbook, talking about the percentages of students from age 6 to 21 by their disability category. So again, 38.2% had a specific learning disability, which was the biggest area. The next biggest being a speech and language impairment, and then other health impairment, followed by autism, intellectual disability, which we consider cognitive impairments, emotional disturbances, which we consider emotional impairments, and then that co-occurrence of disabilities combined. The Individual Education Program, or IEP, is a written document that summarizes a student's learning program. So, not all students have an IEP. It is only for students who are eligible for special education services and supports. And it's a very important way to document all of the things that we will be doing in order to support the student's needs based on their disability area. So, the principal purposes for an IEP are to establish goals, to determine the services that the school must provide. So, for example, if they're getting resource room support, if they are in a cross-categorical classroom, if they're getting speech and language support or occupational therapy support or physical therapy support or all of the things combined. And then also to enhance the communication among parents and other professionals. So a big thing for IEPs is that parents come in, they sign off on this, they're a part of this IEP team to discuss the plan for their student. So it allows us to have a more appropriate and well done partnership. An IEP consists of several parts, which we'll go into this a lot more in depth in another module, but they have annual goals, present levels of performance, and then services and supplementary aids and services such as modifications and accommodations. Some components of the educational programs for students with disabilities include the development of the IEP, choosing appropriate educational environment, so deciding whether or not a student's going to be in the general education classroom for the majority of their day, or if they need to be in a self-contained classroom or another environment entirely, which we'll talk about more from when we talk about LRE. Selecting the curriculum, using evidence-based practices, using culturally responsive instruction, like I talked about on the last slide, developing those good partnerships with families, as well as talking about transitions and professionalism of educators. So, special education teachers need to presume the ability to effectively collaborate with others as a significant part of their responsibilities. They're not in this by themselves. They have to collaborate with other people in order to be successful in implementing a program for their students. Also, all of these educational programs need to be individualized. So, an important guidance to look at is the Andrew F. First Douglas County School District in 2017. The U.S. Supreme Court qualified the nature of special education services by affirming the fact that programs must reflect not only some educational benefit to students, but a clear, appropriate progress. So, educational programs must be reasonably calculated in order to enable the child to make progress that's appropriate in light of their circumstances. this was another visual from our textbook talking about the educational environment. So the majority of our students that are now in special education programs are inside the regular class or their general education class 80% or more of their day. Then we have this next section, about 18.1%, that are in their class 40 to 79% of the day, less than 40% of the day, or just other environments in general, which is only 5.1% now. This brings us to this idea of inclusion. So one of the major ways things have changed since the development of special education is this idea of inclusion, which is educating children with disabilities to as great as extent as possible within the general education classroom. The most consistent theme overall in our field is providing individuals the opportunity to have, with disabilities, the opportunity to have a place in school and in society, and also giving them that place within their peers in the general education setting. So a majority of students with disabilities now do receive their most or all of their education within that general education classroom, and they also have access to the general education curriculum for most or all of their day. For some disability groups, like students with cognitive impairments, emotional impairments, autism spectrum disorder, they have a greater likelihood of educational placements being in inclusive settings for smaller percentages of their day than in other environments. So for an example, I have had students when I was a K-4 resource room teacher, I had students with autism spectrum disorder that I saw for 1 to 5 hours per week, and they were in the general education setting for most of their day. However, now I am teaching in an ASD classroom for severe autism, and my students do not get a lot of time in the general education classroom. They have a special curriculum. They don't use the Common Core curriculum. They get certain times with inclusion that we schedule into the day, but they spend most of their time in a separate classroom because they are on the more severe end of that RT or of the LRE framework. It's also important to note that there are significant differences between states in terms of educational environments. So supported education is an important component to the concept of inclusion, which emphasizes that successful inclusion is based on the provision of appropriate supports in gen ed classrooms as a basis for successful learning environments, which this means that in order for inclusion to be a successful program and a successful concept for students, there have to be appropriate supports in the general education curriculum and classrooms. We can't just expect our students to be able to be successful without those specialized supports. Least restrictive environment is what I was talking about on our last slide a little bit as well. So the least restrictive environment would be that general education classroom, then would be a special education classroom, then a special school, homebound, and then hospital residential facility. So LRE, or least restrictive environment, means that we want to educate students with disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate with their non-disabled peers. So there's a continuum of this educational placement. So like in my last example, what some of my students that I've had in the past in the resource room would be in a general education classroom. Some of my students now are in that special education classroom. And then some students still, even in my program, move to a higher or more restrictive setting as going to a special school. And then also our goal is also to get them into a least restrictive setting where they spend more time in the general education classroom and less time in our classroom without their non-disabled peers. The next thing that we're going to talk about is curriculum. So for curriculum, we have to have the same curriculum that's afforded to students without disabilities. However, this looks very different. So like I stated, my students do not use the Common Core state standards, but they use the essential elements of the Common Core. So we've taken the Common Core and we've developed a more appropriate version of this curriculum for students who are in these types of settings, as in my ASD classroom. So the use of standards-based education means that the curriculum is tied to the state-derived content and performance standards in the core subject areas. The Common Core State Standard Initiative started And they made standards that were research and evidence based and aligned with college and career expectations to prepare students for global success. So, a critical goal of special education is to help students gain the skills and acquire knowledge that will allow them to access and be successful in this curriculum. The intent of developing standards was to have a common set of goals and mileposts, and also to make things more equal across the board. Most students with disabilities must meet these challenging set of standards in order to participate in the state testing process. So these Common Core State Standards initiative that started in 2010 were clear, understandable, and consistent across the board and aligned with those career and college expectations. They were based on rigorous content in the application of knowledge through higher order thinking skills. They were built upon the strengths and lessons of the current state standards, informed by top performing countries to prepare students for success in our global economy and society. So, our major goal here again was to prepare students for college in their career. The question now is whether students will participate in this standard-based system and how well they will do in the system and what types of accommodations and supports they may need. There's also always a balance between addressing the content and performance standards of general education curriculum while ensuring that current and future needs of students are addressed. Another area is called functional curriculum, which is another option, but it is used mostly with students with cognitive impairments or more severe disabilities. Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, has foundations in architecture, so things like ramps, bathroom stalls, curbs. It's built on the assumption that there will be significant learner variability in all the classrooms, but that these classrooms welcome all students, promote positive interactions, provide opportunities for students to demonstrate their knowledge and skills through multiple means, provide flexibility in the presentation of information as well as the ways they demonstrate their skills, and remove barriers that hinder access to the curriculum, and accommodate learning differences with supports and the use of technology. So UDL means that they attend to individuals' needs, they're proactive, they accommodate, they capitalize on the accessible technologies they have, and promote flexibility. It's things that will help all students so that we can make accommodations into our curriculum. UDL has been promoted for over 20 years, and it had a huge increase when it was written into the Every Student Succeed Act. Some primary features of UDL are, again, that they attend to individual needs that don't draw attention away or to one individual. They're proactive rather than reactive in addressing student learning needs. So they're trying to get on top of the learning rather than go back and reteach because things didn't work. Emphasizing curricular materials that attend to the needs of students with special needs increases the utility for all students. Capitalizing on accessible technologies and electronic resources, providing flexibility in the way that information is presented, so the way they might respond or demonstrate their knowledge of skill doesn't have to all be the same. You don't have to give one size fits all types of assessments, and also demonstrating a flexibility in the way of showing that students are engaged. Evidence-based practices are interventions that are validated by empirical research to help increase outcomes. So basically, evidence-based practices just say that we want to make sure that our education and the things that we are teaching students, our education, are scientifically based. We don't want to just teach them random things. We want there to be a reason behind it. So instructional practices supported as being effective for increasing the outcome for a population of learners by multiple high-quality experimental studies. Examples of this include direct instruction, mnemonic strategies, concrete, semi-concrete, and abstract models, etc. There's many different types of evidence-based practices and instructional techniques that are available. Effective instruction needs to be explicit, systematic, and intensive. But there's also a caution that should be taken when adopting evidence-based practices because no practice is valid for all students in all times. So again, methods have been demonstrated effective based on consistent and credible research, but that translating of research into practice has also lagged. So there's difficulty that exists in separating validated from non-validated interventions. This slide talks about the effective intervention and effective instruction and what our instruction needs in order to be effective. So the four areas are that they must be explicit, systematic, comprehensive, and differentiated, as well as intense. So for explicit, it means that there's roots in direct instruction, which have a long history of effectiveness with student disabilities. There's a clear purpose for learning, accompanied by clear and understandable directions and explanations. There's a focus on skills and strategies needed by students. Teacher-directed modeling and demonstration, so not just telling students things, but actually directly modeling and demonstrating examples. Logical sequencing of content, guided practice with specific feedback. So again, not just giving homework assignments and not giving feedback on those assignments, ensuring to give feedback along the way to guide their instruction. Independent practice by learners. Maintenance activities, including periodic review. So when a unit is over, we're not just forgetting about it. We're ensuring that we have maintenance throughout our lessons. And then provisions for generalization among and across content areas. The next area is that interventions and instruction should be systematic. So teachers should focus on instruction of carefully selected and useful sets of skills, and that those skills are organized into a logical sequence for instruction. These are things, again, like direct teacher modeling, frequent student responding, reflective of high engagement, and verified learning. The next area is comprehensive and differentiated, which shows that there's an adjustment in response to specific data. So if you are teaching and you do an assessment, a formative assessment, and see that your students are not understanding a specific concept, that you are using that data to adjust your curriculum and adjust your lesson plans. And then also that they're differentiated based on student needs. And then also intensive instruction, which suggests that there's sufficient time allocated to ensure comprehension, includes a broad scope and sequence, opportunities for students to try out what they've learned, and should also include ample feedback for students. So all effective interventions and instruction has to be explicit, systematic, intensive, and the instruction increases the likelihood that skills and strategies will be acquired by students with special needs. Other important things to note here are that it's more effective when provided early in your development. So interventions are twice as effective if they're delivered in grades 1 or 2 than if started in grade 3 for students with learning disabilities. And also identifying before they fall too far behind their peers in their foundational skills. If a diagnosis of dyslexia, for example, is made in the first 2 grades, more than 80% of children are brought up to grade level, but if not made until 5th grade, only 10 to 15% are helped. And then also this intervention and instruction must occur in the context of the academic skill itself. Your instruction should also have cultural responsiveness. So some culturally responsive practices, that instruction should cater to students from diverse backgrounds. The CRI and CRT mean that it caters to the strengths of students while validating student cultures, makes connections between home and school, fosters appreciation for differences in cultures, and uses multicultural resources. So teachers need to reflect an attitude of openness, sensitivity, and responsiveness to particular needs and backgrounds of students with whom they work. So CRI acknowledges and legitimizes different cultural heritages, connects meaning between home and school experiences, uses a variety of instructional techniques that account for varied learning needs, preferences, communication styles, and teaches students to understand and appreciate their own and other cultural heritages. It also incorporates multicultural knowledge, resources, materials across all subjects taught. Teaching students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds means that you need to have ongoing and varied assessment, ensure respectful activities for all students, use student differences as a basis for your planning, measure growth based on each student's baseline, providing wide variety of materials and activities, and understand that students' literacy in their first language can be used in order to help develop their English skills. Partnerships with families is something we'll talk about in another module as well. It's something that I find very, very important within special education and just education in general. So, partnerships with families. Number one, you encourage families to participate in the special education process by having them be a part of the IEP, be a part of the determination of their services, their placement, their educational abilities. Let the parents talk about their strengths. Parents haven't always been encouraged to participate, but now they are consistently being asked to participate in special education since our processes have changed. The amount and quality participation has also varied greatly, but we're displaying a high degree of personal determination to positively influence education and acceptance of person with special needs and within these partnerships with families. Also to inform, so within forming partnerships, you have to inform parents of their legal rights and then educate families to increase the quality of their participation. Teachers must have a personal philosophy of education, willingness to be agents of social change, be accountable for services provided, possess and continue to develop personal and professional competencies and comprehensive knowledge base, and care deeply about all these human beings. In addition to that, they have to have a foundation for advocacy. So there's 5 critical areas here for teachers to be change agents, but teachers must be data-driven decision makers, implementers of evidence-based practices and instructional strategies, implementers of SEL and behavioral supports, or a manager of behavior, a differentiator of instruction, as well as a collaborator. So teachers have to wear all these different hats, especially within the special education field. And they also must continue their development along with the. We will talk about transition in our last module of the course, but to talk about this really talks about the question posed towards what. So teachers have to be cognizant of how their current instructional and curricular efforts ultimately impact students' transitions into school and community environments that lie ahead. Students face a number of significant transitions in their lives and in their school lives, and each can be crucial to their positive quality of life, most significant being found to be from school to post-school. So young adults with disabilities are disproportionately underrepresented in the workforce, as well in educational training and employment programs. We have an overrepresentation of school dropouts, underrepresentation among receiving diplomas, and again, all of this significantly varies across states. But these transitions are to plan for students to have important, significant transitions be effective. In order for those transition services to be effective, there needs to be transition planning, which again, we will talk about much more in depth in our last module of the course. To end this module, we're going to talk about the special educator's role. So again, like I said in a few slides back, that special education teachers wear a lot of hats. They have to be effective collaborators and operate as part of a team. They have to be effective communicators. They have to be knowledgeable about best practices, provide effective instruction and behavioral support, also using those evidence-based instructional strategies and evidence-based behavioral support strategies, differentiate instruction based on the student's needs, and use data-based decision-making. So a special educator has so many different hats and so many different roles that they must take on every day in order to effectively educate your students. And that leads to talking about the professionalism of educators, especially special educators. So in order to talk about that professionalism, you want to say that you'll have a high degree of self-determination skills, willing to be agents of social change, being accountable, making sure to be an advocate for your students, know that comprehensive knowledge base, but then also not being afraid to tell parents or tell people that you're collaborating with that you might not know the answer, but you can find the answer out, and being willing to research and try to find answers, deeply caring about human beings and your students, developing positive relationships with students, but also with families, and developing those partnerships, personal and professional competencies, using those evidence-based practices, and constantly evaluating your teaching programs and going back to learn about new systems and new things that might help your students. So concluding this module's presentation, you can go into Canvas and complete the necessary discussions as well as assignments and come back to this presentation as needed in order to successfully complete those things. Reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.